New Mystery of the Emblem's Kris is probably one of the most controversial characters ever added into Fire Emblem. For some reason, a lot of people on the internet seem to not like Kris at all, and say a bunch of things about him that aren't even necessarily true. Kris probably suffers the most from the Mandela effect in the entire series of Fire Emblem, with people either just misremembering what he says, or saying that he takes lines from other characters that never indeed does happen at all. The reason behind this is because of the remake of FE3, New Mystery of the Emblem, in comparison to Mystery of the Emblem itself. So I decided to look objectively at the scripts that we have here and analyze why is Kris so hated by the community, what I really do feel Kris brings to the table, and why this effect occurs. For starters, I went through script by script painstakingly of FE3 and New Mystery of the Emblem just to make sure that I wasn't misremembering anything. There is one line in particular that Jagen says basically that he's going to challenge Lang to combat. And for some reason, people tend to remember it as if it's Kris is the one who says it to Lang. But this does not happen in New Mystery of the Emblem at all. Kris never says this line. Jagen indeed says the line to Lang in the same manner that he did in the original game. After looking through every single chapter script, I found that Kris's addition to the story, much like how I remembered, are actually just minimal anecdotal lines. Even one of the biggest complaints that people usually have is that a ton of lore exposure is done onto Kris during Henri's Way instead of being done onto Marth like in FE3. But Marth is Altea's noble. He should know all of this stuff already. It makes much more sense to actually dump this exposition onto Kris, which is the avatar, right? It's basically us. So we're listening to this story for the first time being like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. If anything, I think that was a positive change that was enacted by allowing the player as the avatar to listen to this story through Jagen. There are two things though that are a little bit different that happened throughout the story that were attributed to certain characters but then are attributed to Kris. But I find them to be minimally impactful. The first one is during chapter 17, Marth originally suggests that they take the route through the mountains to avoid having to clash with an army that's stationed nearby. In the remake, Kris suggests that they could possibly avoid that route by passing through the mountains, and Jagen chimes in as well, saying that there's a price to pay if that happens. Basically like regular banter between two generals in an army. And Marth is like, nah, we're gonna do it anyway, and orders the advance. In the chapter right after, he immediately acknowledges this again by saying that was ultimately his choice, but that Marth was heavily influenced by Kris's decision. Which is fine. I don't think that this actually takes away the accomplishment of Marth's achievement at all. I think that this is just a reasonable thing for an advisor to be asked and to then give their opinion on something. The other one is the reason why they believe in Marth. And this one is very similar to something that Jagen says in the original. But instead in this version, Kris is the one who says it. It's not exactly the same, but it is similar enough that you would be like, okay, maybe they did take this line away. However, there is one line that is almost exactly verbatim, and it's after the Garnet chapter where there are stairs leading up to the background that Jagen originally says to Marth, but in this game, it's Kris. So I am indeed very, very upset that it was not Jagen that told me and pointed out the obvious stairs, but instead that we had to deal with Kris telling me. How absurd. At the end of the game, there's also a scene in which Kris basically abdicates all the claims that have occurred during the adventure to say that Marth should be the hero to shoulder this responsibility. Arcanea could unite behind the one true king. Also something in my opinion that does not take away Marth's achievements in the slightest, and it makes sense. After looking at all of this, I started to ponder and be like, but why do people still feel that he is so present in the game? And even when I play it, I realized I was like, Kris is really present in the game. And the reason started to dawn more and more on me. Number one is, Kris is the best combat unit in the game, by far. Significantly more than any other unit in the game. It's pretty impressive how much the gap is between Kris and the next average person, or even your next second best unit. They're just that much better. So having a unit that is constantly doing all combat, constantly present, that you heavily rely on them to do everything, is gonna impact your experience in this game. The second one is that every single base conversation and most of the supports in the game are actually tied to Kris themselves. So every time that you're clicking the button to hear about some lore dump or some extra story or some support, odds are it's actually going to be Kris and nobody else. There are some supports between characters themselves, but you have to deploy those specific characters and you'd have to build up their supports. And it does happen, particularly between Marth and Shido or the White Wings, but more often than not, you're just going to be seeing Kris talk to everybody. And since all the focus of every single support is about him, it makes the game very Kris-centric in this regard. You're always talking about Kris. You're always talking about their experiences. And the supports vary. Some of them are really good, having good quality stuff. Others are just pandering fests. So it's really hard to say where the quality of this lies. But there is a lot of Kris to go around here. So that may have contributed to that feeling. Last but not least, there are a couple of things that happen in the story. There's a prologue and guidance chapters totally dedicated to Kris's arc. Basically, a League of Assassins is sent out to try to kill Marth. The prologue is basically just Kris Festival. It's just a ton of dumping how awesome Kris is the entire time, how good of a combat unit he is, how amazing he is, how he should be the leader of this group, and yada yada yada. And because of that, it really does give you this feeling that everybody sucks up to Kris. And it does happen. To some degree, there is a lot of pandering to Kris. The game does shy away from that after the prologue is over, and it becomes more focused on Marth. And the main story is definitely 100% about Marth. The story is basically just Marth Fest the entire time, with everybody bending over backwards to whatever Marth says and exploring his challenges and the difficulties that he faces. And he relies on Jagan and Kris as his support. I don't see any issues with this whatsoever. There is another complaint that I have about Kris during the story, though, is that sometimes there'll be some random, hey, you want to change your look type story. It's like, oh, we just killed Garnef, but what if you went bald? And I know that that's not exactly what it is at this moment in time, but these type of scenarios are really jarring, and suddenly you're just pulled out of it because Zane was imitating Tiki and said that you should wear a tiara. And that type of stuff doesn't really help the narrative as well. Ultimately, if people stopped regurgitating vitriol about a story that they don't even know about in first place, and they actually just played the game or paid a little bit more attention while they were playing the game, they would notice the issues that are more commonly widespread in terms of complaints of the story regarding Kris aren't actually there at all. I will say this, almost every single line that is added by Kris is an addition, not a subtraction or a substitution in any form or way, barring some specific examples that I already covered. There may be an argument that the additions were not good, or that they weren't even helpful at all and just served to fluff up the game, which is fine. But to outright say that they were changes that were notoriously made that impacted the story and Marth's importance in it, I don't really think is fair or a fair representation of how Kris is in Fire Emblem New Mystery of the Emblem. So what about you guys? You guys think that Kris gets a lot of flack for absolutely no reason? Or do you think that this reason is warranted and that Kris should never have existed in the first place anyway and just done a faithful remake? I for one tend to like it, but let's see down in the comments below what you guys believe in. Please leave a like and subscribe. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really do appreciate it, and see you next time. Bye bye.